When my son got married, I never told him that his mother's life insurance had made me a man worth $11 million. Thank God I kept that to myself, because 6 weeks after the wedding, his new wife sat across from me at my own dinner table and asked, very sweetly, if I'd ever considered adding her name to my accounts, just in case something happened to me. She had no idea I already knew exactly why she was asking. My name is Robert Hale. Everyone calls me Bob. I'm 63 years old and I live in a town called Marion, about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. Until a year ago, I was a retired high school football coach who spent his afternoons refinishing furniture in a garage that still smelled like sawdust and old varnish. Nobody at the diner where I get my coffee every morning knew what was sitting in an account with my name on it. Nobody at church knew either. And that's exactly how I intended to keep it. Stay with me, because this one takes a turn you won't see coming. If you're new to this channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're tuning in from, because you're going to want to see how this ends. My wife's name was Carol. We were married 31 years before the cancer took her, and if you'd asked me on our wedding day what I thought our life together would look like, I never would have guessed it would end with me sitting alone in a lawyer's office at 62 years old, being told I was suddenly worth more money than I'd made in 3 decades of coaching combined. Carol had a life insurance policy through her job as a hospital administrator, a policy she'd quietly increased twice over the years without ever making a big deal of it, and a modest portfolio of investments her father had started for her back in the 70s that she'd never touched and never talked about much either. She used to say money you don't need is money you don't discuss. I didn't understand what she meant by that until much later. Carol passed in October, and the funeral was small, the way she wanted it. Just family, a few of her coworkers from the hospital, and half the football boosters from my old team who still called me coach 20 years after I stopped coaching. Our son Nathan flew in from Charlotte, where he worked in commercial real estate, and stood next to me at the graveside looking like he didn't quite know what to do with his hands. Nathan was 28 then, a good kid underneath it all, though I'll admit Carol and I had spent a fair amount of energy over the years worrying about the people he chose to spend his time with. He had a habit of falling hard and fast for the wrong kind of person, someone flashy, someone who made him feel important in a way he never quite felt on his own. Carol used to say Nathan wanted so badly to matter to somebody that he'd hand the keys to anyone who asked nicely enough. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat down with Carol's attorney, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Diane Ferris, who'd handled our family's paperwork for almost 20 years. I expected to talk about the house, maybe some savings bonds, things that would help me get through the next few years comfortably. I did not expect Diane to slide a folder across her desk and walk me through numbers that made my ears ring. Between the life insurance payout, the investment accounts Carol's father had started, and the equity in a small rental property Carol had bought years earlier, without ever mentioning it, I was suddenly sitting on just over $11 million. I asked Diane to repeat the number twice, not because I hadn't heard her, but because it didn't sound like it belonged to my life. She told me Carol had left a letter as well, sealed, addressed just to me. I didn't open it in that office. I folded it into my coat pocket and drove home with both hands on the wheel, feeling like the truck might tip if I took a curve too fast. That night at my kitchen table, I read the letter twice through, and by the time I finished, I'd made a decision that would shape everything that came after. Carol had written that she never told me the full extent of her savings because she'd watched what money did to people in her own family growing up, how it turned brothers into strangers and made every conversation about love secretly a conversation about inheritance. She asked me, in her own careful handwriting, to be smart about how I handled it, especially with Nathan. Protect him from people who might see him as a way in before they see him as a person worth loving for himself. I sat with that letter a long time, and I decided right then I wasn't going to tell anyone about the money. Not my sister, not the boosters at the diner, and especially not Nathan, who at the time was 8 months into a relationship with a woman named Chelsea Marsh and talking more and more about a wedding. Nathan had met Chelsea at a work conference in Atlanta the year before, and from the first time he brought her home for Thanksgiving, something about her didn't sit easy with me, though I couldn't have told you exactly what it was. She was polite, always complimented the house, always asked good questions at dinner about my coaching days and Carol's work at the hospital. She had a way of remembering small details and bringing them up later that made people feel flattered, listened to, important. Nathan was completely under her spell, and honestly, for a long while, I told myself I should just be grateful he'd found someone who made him happy. Carol had been more cautious about Chelsea than I was, back before she got sick. I remember Carol saying once, quietly, after Chelsea left one Sunday dinner, that the girl asked an awful lot of questions about our finances for someone who'd only known the family a few months. I brushed it off at the time. I wish I hadn't. The engagement came about 4 months after Carol passed, right in the middle of the estate being finalized. Nathan called me from Charlotte, practically shouting with excitement, and asked if Chelsea and I could sit down together soon because she wanted to talk about the wedding budget and whether the family might be able to help. When they visited that spring, Chelsea brought up, almost in passing over coffee, how sorry she was about Carol, and then, in the very same breath, asked whether the hospital had a good pension program, whether Carol had carried life insurance through her job like most administrators did. I remember the exact way she watched my face after she asked it, like she was checking for a reaction the way you'd check a scale for a number you already suspected. I told her I wasn't sure, that Carol handled all of that, and changed the subject to the weather. But something in my chest had gone cold and stayed that way. Wedding planning turned into its own kind of quiet pressure that summer. Chelsea wanted a venue at a restored barn about an hour outside Charlotte, the kind of place where a single Saturday evening costs more than most families spend on a car. Nathan called me more than once sounding stressed, saying they were trying to figure out how to make the numbers work without going into debt right out of the gate. And every time he said that, something in me twisted, because I had $11 million sitting quietly in an account, and my son was doing math on a legal pad trying to figure out how many guests they could afford to feed. I ended up quietly covering most of the wedding costs myself, wiring the deposits directly to the venue and the caterer, telling Nathan it came from Carol's savings and a modest insurance payout, which wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth either. Chelsea, for her part, seemed very interested in how those payments were actually being handled. She asked Nathan more than once whether his dad had come into some kind of settlement or windfall recently, framing it lightly, almost like a joke. But her eyes weren't joking when she said it. According to Nathan, who mentioned it to me completely innocently, having no idea he was handing me exactly the confirmation I already suspected, I let it go without comment, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to open yet. Looking back now, I can see how carefully Chelsea laid her groundwork that whole summer, always sounding harmless, always dressed up as concern for the family's well-being. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking a nervous bride, worried about money. Like every bride worries about money. I was wrong about that, and it wouldn't take much longer to find out exactly how wrong. The wedding itself, I'll be honest, was lovely. Nathan looked exactly the way I remembered feeling on my own wedding day, nervous and lit up at the same time. And for a few hours that October afternoon, I let myself just be a proud father, instead of a man carrying a secret the size of a small fortune. The barn looked beautiful, with the leaves changing outside, string lights hung from the rafters, everyone laughing and dancing. Chelsea's mother, a sharp-tongued woman named Pam, who flew in from Phoenix, cornered me near the bar at one point and said, out of nowhere, that it was such a comfort knowing Nathan had a father who could help the two of them get established properly. I said something forgettable and smiled, but I noticed exactly how she watched my face afterward, like she was checking for a reaction too, the same way her daughter had done months earlier. During the toasts, Chelsea stood up with a glass of champagne and talked about building a secure future and making smart financial decisions together as a family, which struck me as an odd thing to center a wedding toast around instead of love or partnership. A few guests laughed politely, unsure if it was meant as a joke. Nathan looked happy and a little embarrassed, the way grooms do when a toast gets slightly off script. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath the applause, I felt that same cold feeling I'd had since that spring afternoon over coffee. This wasn't a nervous bride talking about the future in general terms. This was a young woman who had already been thinking very specifically about numbers she didn't officially know existed. I danced with Nathan at one point, an old tradition we'd started when he was young enough to stand on my feet, and I told him how proud I was of the man he'd become. Every word of that was true. But driving home alone that night, I already knew something was coming, even if I couldn't have said exactly what yet. The honeymoon lasted 8 days, a trip to the Smoky Mountains that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, again dressed up as money I'd been setting aside. When they got back and settled into married life, something shifted. Chelsea started calling me. Not through Nathan, but directly, which she had almost never done before the wedding. She'd ask if I wanted to come over for Sunday dinner, or whether I needed help going through Carol's old things, offering in a roundabout way to help me organize my finances now that I was managing everything alone for the first time. At first, I told myself this was just a new daughter in law trying to build a relationship with her husband's father. And honestly, some part of me wanted to believe that because I still hoped Chelsea might turn out to be good for my son, despite everything. But the calls kept coming, always warm, always casual, and always circling eventually towards some version of the same question. How was I managing my accounts now that Carol wasn't there to handle that side of things? Did I have a good system in place? Had I ever thought about consolidating everything somewhere so it would be easier to track as I got older, especially with nobody looking after it day to day? She said all of this in the same gentle, concerned tone you'd use asking about someone's blood pressure. But I had spent 30 years coaching teenage boys, and you learn fast how to recognize a kid softening you up before he asks for the car keys. Chelsea was doing the exact same thing, just with better vocabulary and a wedding band. One Saturday afternoon, she showed up at my place, unannounced, with a casserole dish she said she'd made from one of Carol's old recipe cards, sat at my kitchen table for close to 2 hours, and steered the conversation no fewer than 3 separate times toward the importance of having a trusted family member as a backup on financial accounts, just in case anything ever happened to me suddenly, the way it had happened to Carol. I nodded along and gave her nothing. But that night, sitting alone at that same kitchen table where I'd read Carol's letter, I admitted something to myself I'd been avoiding for weeks. My daughter in law knew. I needed to understand exactly how much Chelsea knew and how she'd found it out in the first place. So I called an old friend, a man named Gary Whitlow, who I'd coached alongside for nearly 15 years before he left teaching to open a small investigative and background check business that mostly handled employment screenings for local companies. I laid the whole situation out for him over coffee at the diner: the insurance payout, the investments, Chelsea's questions creeping in earlier every month. Gary didn't look surprised. He told me estate filings related to insurance payouts and certain trust transfers often leave a paper trail that's more accessible than people realize, especially once probate touches any part of it, which mine had. Because of the rental property Carol owned outright, it took him less than 20 minutes at his own laptop to confirm the rough shape of the number himself, just to demonstrate how easy it was for anyone patient enough to look. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He asked exactly when Nathan had proposed to Chelsea. I told him, and Gary pulled up the date the estate paperwork had cleared probate and become part of the public record. Carol died in October. The rental property transfer became visible in county records in late January. Nathan proposed to Chelsea the first week of February. Gary looked at me across that table and said quietly, "Bob, I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your son." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself plenty of young men propose in February, that Valentine's season alone probably accounts for half the engagements in this country, that I was building a conspiracy out of coincidence and a few uncomfortable questions over a casserole. But some part of me, the part that had spent months quietly cataloging every small thing, already knew Gary was probably right, and I needed real proof before I said a single word to Nathan. Gary offered to dig further, and I told him to go ahead before I'd even finished thinking it through, because at that point I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him a little over 2 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable, it was almost predictable once you saw the shape of it laid out on paper. Chelsea had been engaged once before, about 3 years earlier, to a man named Derek, whose family owned a chain of regional car dealerships across 2 states. That engagement had ended abruptly 7 months in, right around the time Derek's father restructured the business, and Derek's expected role in it quietly shrank. There was no public drama, no lawsuit, just a fast, quiet breakup that Derek's old college roommate described to Gary as her losing interest almost overnight, once it became clear the money wasn't flowing the direction she'd expected. Gary also found a pattern in Chelsea's employment history. 3 different jobs at wealth management firms in 5 years, each one ending not long after client complaints about her overstepping professional boundaries. Twice with older widowed clients specifically, offering to help manage personal finances in ways that went well past her actual job description. One firm had quietly let her go after a client's family raised concerns about her being added as an emergency contact on private accounts. None of it was criminal exactly. Nothing that would hold up cleanly in a courtroom. But all of it painted the same picture again and again. A woman who found opportunity in people's grief and vulnerability and moved quickly once she sensed real money nearby. I sat with that file for a long time out in my garage that night, the same garage where I used to feel most like myself, sanding down an old dresser or refinishing a chair. And I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with Carol's money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was preparing. I decided not to say anything to Nathan right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Chelsea was willing to go, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong about all of it. I didn't have to wait long to find out I wasn't. About 6 weeks after the wedding, Chelsea called and asked if she could stop by on Saturday to help me go through some of Carol's paperwork, just to make sure everything was organized properly now that I was on my own. Nathan was traveling for work that weekend, closing a deal in Nashville, which she mentioned almost too casually. I told her Saturday would be fine. When Saturday came, she arrived with a bottle of wine and a folder tucked under her arm, and sat down across from me at that same kitchen table, the very one where I'd read Carol's letter, and where Gary and I had spread out his file weeks earlier. She poured us both a glass of wine I barely touched and worked her way gently into it, saying she'd been thinking a lot about what would happen if something ever happened to me suddenly, the way it had happened to Carol, so unexpected, so fast. She said it would give her and Nathan real peace of mind if my accounts had a secondary contact listed, someone who could step in immediately without waiting on lawyers and courts, someone who already understood the family. She smiled and said she'd actually looked into it and could bring over the paperwork from her bank. It would only take a signature. I looked at her across that table for a long moment, and then I asked her, calmly, if she wanted to know how I'd found out about Derek. Her face changed instantly, the warmth cracking right off it in real time. She asked what I was talking about, but her voice had lost that easy, practiced softness, and something tighter and more careful took its place. I told her plainly, no yelling, no dramatics, just facts laid out one after another, the way I used to break down game film for a player who needed to see exactly where he'd gone wrong. I told her about the probate timeline, about the engagement to Derek that ended right when his family's business changed hands, about the pattern at 3 different firms, about the client who'd flagged her for trying to get added to private accounts. I told her I knew about her questions over Sunday dinners, her phone calls about consolidating my finances, every single thread she thought she'd woven so carefully over the past several months. She tried to recover, said I was misunderstanding completely, that this was purely about family security, that any responsible person plans ahead for the worst. I let her talk for almost a full minute without interrupting, because I wanted her to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually spoken out loud instead of dressed up in a warm voice over a casserole dish. When she finally stopped, I slid the folder she'd brought back across the table toward her, closed, untouched, and told her I wasn't signing anything that day or any day after it. Then I told her something else I'd been holding on to for weeks, waiting for exactly the right moment. I told her Nathan was going to hear every word of this from me before the week was out. She left not long after that, gathering her things quickly, her hands not quite steady. Clearly understanding this had turned into something very different from the quiet Saturday afternoon she'd planned. I sat alone at that kitchen table for a long while afterward, staring at the folders she'd left behind, unsigned, the wine going warm in both untouched glasses. Nathan got back from Nashville on Sunday night, and I called him first thing Monday morning, asking him to come by the house alone, telling him it was important, telling him I loved him, and that this wasn't easy for me either. He showed up a couple hours later looking nervous, asking immediately if I was sick, if something was wrong with my health, clearly bracing for the worst kind of news a son can imagine. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him months earlier. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, made him coffee the way he'd always liked it since he was a teenager, and I told him everything, starting with Carol's letter and ending with Chelsea, sitting in that exact chair 3 days earlier. Nathan sat completely still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the $11 million first, and watched his face move through shock, and then something close to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honestly that I'd been scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people look at you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anyone looked at his wedding either, or at him. He nodded slowly, absorbing that part, and I could see him understanding it, even through the sting of it. Then I moved to Chelsea, and that's when his whole posture changed. I laid the timeline out in front of him, the dates, side by side, his mother's death, the property transfer becoming public record, Chelsea's proposal timing, 2 weeks later. I told him about Derek, about the car dealership family, about the pattern at the 3 different firms, and the client complaint that got her let go. I told him about that Saturday afternoon, the folder, the wine she'd poured that I never drank. Nathan didn't say much at first. He just sat there very quietly for almost a full minute, staring at the folder still sitting on my counter, the one Chelsea had left behind. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. He said, "She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will since Mom passed. I hadn't known that detail." It confirmed everything Gary had already found, laid out fresh and painful from Nathan's own memory. He thanked me quietly for telling him, then asked for the folder and Gary's full report, and said he needed to go home and think, and that he wanted to talk to Chelsea himself before he decided anything. I didn't hear from him for 3 days, and those were 3 of the longest days I'd had since Carol's funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn out but clear, the voice of someone who'd already made a decision and just needed to say it out loud to make it feel real. He told me the conversation with Chelsea had gone about as badly as he'd expected. She denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming him, saying he must have told his father lies about her, twisting the whole situation around until her own behavior somehow looked like a reasonable response to a family that didn't trust her. Nathan told her plainly that asking pointed questions about a father-in-law's will while planning a wedding wasn't the same as simply being cautious, and she didn't have a good answer for that. He also told me her mother Pam had gotten involved, calling him directly to insist he was overreacting, that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for Nathan that Pam had likely known exactly what her daughter was doing from the beginning. By the end of that conversation, Nathan told Chelsea he needed space, packed a bag, and drove to a friend's place across town instead of staying in their apartment that night. He told me he wasn't making any final decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken that he didn't think could be repaired, not after seeing the timeline laid out, not after remembering her own questions about my will on his own. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a level head instead of rage, and he said something back that stayed with me a long time afterward. He said, "You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting." 5 weeks later, Nathan filed for an annulment. His attorney explained that, given how quickly everything had unraveled, and the clear pattern of what Chelsea had been after before the marriage even took place, it was a cleaner path than a drawn-out divorce. Chelsea didn't fight it much once she understood that Gary's report existed as documented, organized evidence, understanding correctly that dragging the whole thing out publicly would only make her look worse in the end. Pam called Nathan a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf, but he'd stopped answering by then, telling me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I sat down properly with Nathan a few weeks after that. No folders, no reports, just the two of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon. And I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd rushed past in that first difficult conversation. I told him about Carol's letter in full, about how much she'd worried over the years about him falling for someone who wanted him for the wrong reasons, about how she'd tried gently to warn me about Chelsea before she got sick, and I hadn't fully listened. I told him the $11 million sat there, almost like a strange final gift from a woman who'd spent her whole life quietly taking care of people without ever making a show of it. I told him I wanted to set some of it aside for him properly, with a lawyer, with paperwork done the right way, not hidden, not rushed, and definitely not connected to anyone who hadn't earned that kind of trust. He cried a little at that, not from sadness this time, but something closer to relief, and told me he didn't care nearly as much about the money as he cared about the fact that I'd been quietly protecting him the whole time, even when he had no idea there was anything to protect him from. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday afternoon Chelsea sat across from me with a folder and a bottle of wine, waiting for a signature she never got. Nathan is doing well, back in Marion more often than he used to be, taking weekend trips to visit, throwing himself into work in a way that seems to genuinely energize him instead of just filling time. We talk most days now, real conversations, not the careful surface-level ones we used to have back when I was carrying a secret without even realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting him. I still think about Carol often, about the letter she left me, about the strange way her money ended up doing something she probably hoped it never would have to do, exposing someone who would have hurt our son if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. People sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Nathan about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest answer is no, not for one single second. If I had told him, if I had told anyone, Chelsea would have had exactly what she wanted from the very beginning, and I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my own son. It was about giving the truth enough room to show itself naturally, without me forcing it, without anyone having a reason to perform a kindness they didn't actually feel. Thank God I didn't say anything, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed. Real proof, real clarity, and a son who is safe, single, and finally free to build a life with someone who wants him for who he is, instead of what his father is quietly worth. If you're a father who's ever had to make a hard call to protect your own child, even one they didn't understand at the time, I think you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention. If this one hit home for you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments what you would have done in my place. I'll see you in the next one.